So, in this last lecture, ultimately we look at the highest levels of organization on this planet, which is community interactions and ecosystems. Now let me recap again what the difference between communities and ecosystems are. Community is all living things in an area. So when we look at an area in which these organisms are residing, we look not only at one organism, but all of the interactions of all of the organisms within that environment and some of the dynamics that occur as a result. There are about 5 different types of interactions that can affect the evolution of these species, as well as the dynamics of how the ecosystem thrives and survives. And then ecosystems not only looks at life, but also non-living aspects such as energy flow, water recycling, nutrient cycling, and things of that sort. And so the latter half of this will look at the actual ecological pyramid, we'll look at the hierarchy of life, as well as the dynamics of how energy flows through an ecosystem and how nutrients are recycled within an ecosystem through the various living organisms. So those will be the last 2 concepts. Your questions on your quiz are pretty much split down the middle, so half of them are going to be on community interactions and the other half on ecosystem relationships and dynamics. All right. So one of the things you're going to see too as you start talking about the community interactions is that evolution of some species is completely dependent upon some of these interactions. The things that have evolved within a species comes about because of their interactions with other organisms within the same region. Now there are 6 here, but there's really only 5 because I consider herbivory and predation one and the same. It just matters what you eat. And in fact, when we look at the relationship of how that affects the population, its overall growth and such, it's the exact same relationship. So on your quiz, you're not going to see a difference between herbivory and predation because all herbivores are just they eat the plants and other types of organisms, whereas predators eat other animals and things of that sort. But the relationship that we're going to study is pretty much the same. So it's going to be seen as predation. Now, these pluses and minuses, from what we learned before spring break, we were talking about what dynamics affect the population's growth rate. And that's really what these pluses and minuses mean. A minus means it negatively affects the population growth rate. A plus means it positively affects the population growth rate, meaning it increases and sustains the population in its growth. So the negative obviously decreases the population's ability to grow. It limits its growth rate as well as the number of organisms. And I've got several videos to show many of the dynamics of these that will be represented by quiz questions you'll have regarding them. So let's start with competition. This is the only interaction between living organisms that is not beneficial in any way. In fact, this leads to a particular principle that we study in ecosystems called the competitive exclusion principle. So 2 species competing over a resource ultimately hurts both species. 1 or 2 things have to happen in the competition. Either one species wins, and when we talk about winning, we mean surviving, and the other species essentially dies off because it cannot outcompete the other species. Okay, so that's one way. There's another way though. They can co-evolve, in which case they each start using a different aspect of that ecological niche, which is the resources that they need, the space, the food, and whatnot. And by this coevolution, because they change their ecological niche, and I'll give you some examples of this, then both species survive. And we see both of these things. We see out-competition, where one survives and the other dies off, or we see coevolution of these species, where individuals within the population essentially adapt to a different ecological niche within that environment, and the competition stops. But this is what we call the competitive exclusion principle, which is that no two species can indefinitely occupy the same ecological niche. One or other of those things will happen. Now, let me show you some examples. If very closely related species of bird tend to inhabit the same tree, in some situations they might compete over the space. However, through coevolution, some birds may prefer the top branches where they might undergo their nesting and feeding and things of that sort and reproduction, and others might favor more lower branches. And this type of coevolution allows them to both use the ecological resource in a different way. And so the competition stops, okay, and both species end up surviving. Now, that's not always the case. In some cases, you just outcompete other species completely and eradicate them from that environment, and you win out. Okay, so that's competition. Neither species benefits from it, but it does lead to coevolution. In some cases, however, it leads to whichever one is best fit and can outcompete the other of the species. But it harms both in the process. Now, the next three are what we call symbiosis. Now, most of the time when people think of symbiosis or symbiotic relationships, they think of the first one, mutualism. But there are actually two others, commensalism and parasitism. And so symbiosis is not synonymous with mutualism. Mutualism is one type of symbiosis, commensalism is another type of symbiosis, and parasitism is actually a form of symbiosis. So what does symbiosis actually mean? It essentially is one organism benefits from another organism. But does the other organism benefit in return? Well, in these three types of interactions, one of them is mutually beneficial, which is why we call it mutualism, in which both species benefit from the partnership. And I'm going to show you a video that illustrates this in a second. But we've talked about a number of these types of mutualistic relationships, like a lichen, where the fungi and the algae both help each other. That's a perfect example of a mutualistic relationship. We have many examples of mutualism in our bodies as well, one of which there are microorganisms, bacteria within our intestines that actually take of the feces that we cannot break down, and they break it down into essential vitamins and nutrients. So without those microorganisms in our intestines, we really can't get all of the vitamins that we always need. That's one of the reasons why when we take antibiotics, usually people suggest to take probiotics, which are yogurts and other types of things that have this good bacteria and such, because we are not only killing off the bad bacteria that are causing the disease, but we're also affecting the good bacteria that we have this mutualistic relationship with. Now, here's one of the things about mutualism. It not only creates a partnership that benefits both individuals, but it also creates what we call an interdependency, meaning if one of the two organisms that are in this mutualistic relationship die off, or because of some other type of relationship, predation or competition or something like that, ultimately the other one is harmed as well. It's not just one goes away and says, "Oh, well, I'm still fine." No, the relationship when it leaves also hurts the other one as a result. Think about it. If the lichens if the fungi don't have the algae, they can't get the nutrients that they need. And if the algae don't have the fungi, they can't get the protection that they need, and they both are harmed as a result of one being lost. If we don't have those bacteria in our intestines, then we don't get a lot of the vitamins that we need as a result of it, and so on and so forth. So you can see how this interdependency, it's beneficial when both are there, but when one is lost, it hurts the other as a result of that. Now, commensalism. Most people have not heard of commensalism. Commensalism is where one benefits but neither hurts nor helps the other. So in this scenario, if the organism that was symbiotic were to all of a sudden go away, it wouldn't hurt the other individual. Let me give you some examples. Moss. Moss is a type of plant that can actually use a tree as its kind of anchor to be able to support itself. The moss benefit from this relationship, but the tree doesn't. The tree is not hurt because the moss isn't parasitic, nor is the tree helped because the moss, unlike fungi, doesn't really give anything back to the tree. So this is an example of commensalism. Another example, barnacles on a whale. The barnacles essentially attach to the whale and they get a free ride. As the whale travels through the oceans, they essentially are filter feeders and they are able to get the nutrients that they need. Now, they're not parasitic. They don't suck the blood from the whale, nor do they give anything back to the whale. So that's another example of commensalism. A third example of commensalism is us. We have these little mites that live in our hair follicles in our skin, and they don't give anything back to us. They just get a free ride in our skin. Make you crawl a little bit. But ultimately, these mites in our hair follicles, this is an example of commensalism. If they were to all of a sudden go away, we would be neither helped nor hurt from that. And so that's why it's a +0 relationship. Okay? Now the last one is parasitism. Now a lot of times people wouldn't think parasites are actually a form of symbiosis, but they are, because again, this is where one organism is benefiting from the other. Now in this relationship, it is harmful, but as we've mentioned, parasites also evolve to a point where they don't outright kill the host. A good parasite is one that can live in the host and not kill it. However, it does weaken the host, which is why it has a negative relationship. The parasite can spread disease, can weaken the host, can rob the host of nutrients and things of that sort. But it's still considered symbiosis. It's still a form of symbiosis because of the definition of symbiosis. So, mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. These are 3 examples of symbiosis that I'll test you on. Now, the last one is an obvious one, predation. And again, I said herbivory is tied in with predation because ultimately this is a relationship where one organism outright kills the other organism. So whether it's an animal eating another animal or an animal consuming a photosynthetic organism, these are all very well understood relationships where the predator always benefits and the prey is hurt in that process. Now, all of these types of interactions are actually key for the stability of an ecosystem except one, competition. Competition is the only one that brings no stability to an ecosystem. Mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, and predation, these are all ways in which the dynamics of interactions in which species have in an environment help to support that. Even predation has its key role in making sure that there is proper balance within the ecosystem. Now, that brings us to our last concept of this part, keystone species. A keystone species is essentially any organism in an environment that makes up a small proportion of the community, yet the disappearance of this species can have drastic influence or dramatic collapse of the ecosystem. So a keystone species is not a species that forms the bulk of any species in an environment. In fact, in some cases, they might just be a very, very, very small portion. However, they, like a keystone in a building, though small, provide stability for that ecosystem. Now, there's not always just one keystone species. There can actually be several keystone species. Species that aren't keystone species, when they disappear, they don't have a huge dramatic effect on the stability of the ecosystem. Let me give you some examples. The elephants in the savanna are a keystone species, which is why we're so concerned about the predation of elephants for their ivory and killing them off, not because the elephants are predators in the sense that they keep other species populations down, but in fact, because of the elephant's diet on particular trees, they keep the tree population down. Well, why is that important in the savanna? Well, the main food staple in the savanna are essentially the grasslands. And these grass is the main food for most of the organisms. If the elephants go away, the trees do not have any type of check on their overall growth, and they'll actually outcompete the grass. And so if you start having more trees and fewer grass, you have less food for all of the species in the environment. And that's why elephants, though they form a very small portion of the number of individuals within a species or within its ecosystem, exerts a very strong influence on the community's diversity. If you don't keep the tree population down, the grassland starts decreasing, and the food for all of the organisms that eat that food also start decreasing. It has huge dramatic effects on the stability of the ecosystem. So, one of the things I also want to bring up, and this gets into evolution as well, many of the things that we see in evolution have a lot to do with these predator-prey relationships. I told you that coevolution typically occurs with competition, but predator-prey relationships has created a number of fascinating different types of things. We've already talked a little bit about some of these, like camouflage. I mean, look at some of these insects that looked exactly like their environment. But again, this is situational. Take this insect into a different environment, and it's no longer camouflaged. Okay? Take the frog into a different environment where they haven't had any exposure, they may not understand that warning coloration that they're poisonous. And so ultimately, these are area specific where these processes develop through evolution, but they're not always advantageous in any particular area. Succession. Now, when we look at an ecosystem, ultimately, we want to ask the question, is the ecosystem, collapsing, or is it doing well? When the ecosystem is developing or has a setback but starts to develop back again, this is what we call succession. So succession is essentially how the ecosystem builds up. But there are two ways in which this can occur. One is de novo, or from scratch. And this is what we call primary succession. This is where there's no development of the soil, so you don't get plants. These are areas that, for one reason or another, don't really have any life in them. Now, there's not too many places on our planet that are like that, but there are some places. So here's what happens with primary succession. Ultimately, it starts off really, really slow. The first thing that has to occur is you have to start developing the soil. That requires a particular species called a lichen. Remember, this is a combination of both fungi and algae, where the fungi, their main job is decomposition. The algae's main job is photosynthesis. And so as as the sunlight generates energy through photosynthesis through these algae, and the fungi are able to recycle the nutrients, that starts the development of the soil. But this takes a long time to occur. As the soil begins to develop, other organisms can start invading. You can have mosses, which remember are one type of plant that are in these environments. Then you can end up having much larger organisms. As you start getting these larger plants, you start getting other animals, you'll get other types of organisms that reside in these areas. And then eventually it gets to the point where there's a great diversity of life. Now, not everything develops into a forest. If you look at a desert, you may look at it and say, well, there's not much life there. And you're right. Compared to other areas, there isn't. However, there still was a degree of succession in the desert where the organisms that are adapted to that environment are able to thrive and grow. So succession doesn't mean that you reach a certain number of trees and other things. It means when you reach that end of the succession, the environment is sustaining as much life as it can. A desert can't sustain as much life as a tropical rainforest because of the amount of nutrients and water flow and temperature and things of that sort. However, both have had their successions. Now, how long does this take? Primary succession can take hundreds and hundreds of years, usually somewhere upwards of a millennia, to go from nothing to go to what we call the climax community. Okay? Now this occurs in aquatic ecosystems as well, but we're mainly going to focus on land for our purposes. Now, there's another type of succession, and this happens more readily than primary succession. It's called secondary succession. So what is secondary succession? Well, it's when an ecosystem bounces back from some type of collapse. A forest fire kills off a good number of trees, scatters a lot of the animals and whatnot, really destroys a lot of life. However, look, the soil is still developed. There's still many organisms that live in this environment. It doesn't start from scratch. And so this is much easier to come back from, usually on the order of, say, 100 years or so, a couple generations of various organisms to get back to where it was before. And in fact, in many cases, the death of these organisms is actually healthy for the ecosystem. They found that when they didn't allow parts of forests to burn, you'd get these mega fires, and they're finding now that it's actually very healthy for certain parts, and so they do what they call controlled burns to be able to help reset a lot of the things. Nature creates its own fires as well, and a lot of times we don't let those happen because we're living around it or whatnot. But it's been taking care of itself long before we were here and whatnot. Ultimately, secondary succession is when it comes back from some destruction, where it's trying to reach that climax community again, but it doesn't have to start from scratch. Okay? So this can be done from a forest fire. This can be done from some type of collapse because of the disappearance of a organism, an animal or whatnot. But that's really the main difference. Most everybody has heard of the food chain. Okay? And when we talk about the food chain, we talk about a linear relationship from one level of the ecosystem to the next. Now, in total, there are 4 what we call trophic levels within an ecosystem. Remember how we talked about autotrophs and heterotrophs? That's what we're talking about here. So each trophic level has a distinct group of organisms that belong to it. The first trophic level, and these are both aquatic and terrestrial, the first trophic level are the autotrophs, also called producers. Why? Because these are the photosynthesizers. These are the ones that bring all new energy into an ecosystem. We've talked many times this semester about entropy and how every time energy is transferred from one organism to the next, you never fully transfer all the energy. So energy is constantly being lost due to heat. Okay, that's entropy. That's why every ecosystem, the foundation or the stability of any ecosystem is always on its producers, on its autotrophs. Because without them, there is no life. There is no way in which an environment can survive without photosynthesis. Now, yes, there are certain places and locations on our planet Earth in the deep recesses of the oceans that don't have any photosynthetic activity, but they are few and far between. They usually live off of what we call hydrothermal vents, where you have heat as a source of energy and nutrients that come up from these the gases and other things like that, but they're very few and far between. Most life essentially relies completely on photosynthesis. Okay, so on land, these are the plants. In water, these are usually the protists, the algae, the cyanobacteria, and things of that sort. These are all belong to the producers. So just because we say producers and autotrophs doesn't mean we just mean plants. We mean all producers, all photosynthesizers, all algae, all bacteria that can photosynthesize and the like. Okay? Now, notice it's a pyramid, meaning there must be a great abundance of these organisms for any ecosystem to survive. It can't be upside down. It can't be top heavy or collapses. It must be bottom heavy, where there's sufficient energy production at its base, otherwise everything else collapses. Now, the second trophic level. These are where we start having what we call heterotrophs. Now, heterotrophs are just organisms that must consume other organisms to get their energy. And pretty much these top three, this is the animal kingdom. Okay? That's pretty much what's in these top three. Because we're all heterotrophs, we have to consume other organisms to get our food, but it depends upon what we consume. So for example, if you are in this level, then you're pretty much an herbivore. These are what we call primary consumers. These are insects and other organisms that are pure vegetarians, so to speak, where they only eat autotrophs. They only eat the producers. So these are what we call the primary consumers. Okay, well, what if you don't like eating vegetables? Okay, secondary consumers, these are ones that eat the primary consumers. Okay, so like a bird eating an insect. So insects, as we know, are animals. In fact, they're one of the most abundant animals. And so really, secondary consumers are carnivores. If you eat insects, you're a carnivore. So a bird eating an insect or eating a beetle, which eats a plant, that's considered a secondary consumer. And then of course you have the top of the food chain. Notice the quotations means I don't believe you. No, my kid's watching Lego Movie. The top is the tertiary consumers, or sharks, eagles, lions, bears, any number of these organisms that pretty much don't have something that eats them, so to speak, in nature. But it's never really this simple. When you actually look at the food chain, it looks more like this. It looks more like a food web than a chain. So when we study it in a linear relationship, but think about it. You've got omnivores that eat both plant and animal. Where do they fit in? And we're considered omnivores because we have the capacity to eat both plant and animal. Some organisms can solely eat other animals. They don't have the digestion for plant material. Others solely have the digestion for plant material, in which case they would be just a herbivore or a primary consumer. But again, nothing in life is that simple where we have a linear relationship. That being said, you will be tested on this linear relationship and understanding it, but just be aware that it's more complex than what this actually illustrates. But another thing that I like about the energy pyramid illustrates another concept of energy flow. Because remember, when we study ecosystems, we not only study the living organisms, but the non-living, which energy belongs to in that type of concept. Notice that as you go up the pyramid, there's fewer and fewer organisms. And that's due to the fact that not only due to entropy, but also due to waste in, think about how much you eat every day and how much you defecate every day. That is the proper word for it. Ultimately, you only extract a tiny portion of the food. Why is that? Well, because you don't have every enzyme for every type of organic material out there. We can't break down fiber for energy. We can't break down some other types of substrates. Remember, we even just talked about the bacteria can break down things that we can't to be able to give us vitamins. And so a lot of the biological material that we consume doesn't get incorporated into our body. In fact, only 10% of what you consume actually gets incorporated into your system. The other 90% goes away. Well, it's not that that 90% gets wasted. That's where this other group comes into play, where we have what are called the decomposers. The decomposers is made up of many, many, many different types of groups. You have the animal kingdom, the fungi. That's what mainly defines the fungi kingdom, is decomposition. You've got archaea, you've got bacteria. The only kingdom that doesn't have any decomposers in it is what? What kingdom is devoid of decomposers, do you think? Remember, we've got animal, plant, protists, and fungi. What do you think? No one? I know we've got 2 weeks left. Everybody's like, just tell me the answer. Plants. Plants are the only kingdom that don't have any decomposers. Remember, plants are pure photosynthesizers. So, decomposers, protists. You've got slime molds. You've got worms and other organisms in the animal kingdom that are decomposers. So decomposers aren't classified as part of any of the trophic level because they feed off of the dead and the waste of all levels. And that's why they're in a group of their own. So they're very important for the stability of any ecosystem, but they're not part of these trophic levels because of their relationship where they don't actually feed off of other organisms, but when a plant dies, then they'll break down its organic material. When an animal dies, then it'll break down its organic material. Or when a tree drops its leaves, when it goes through hibernation, it'll break down the waste or the detritus. It'll break down the feces from many of these other organisms. So ultimately, decomposers play a major role in recycling much of the material that goes through us that is not metabolized and incorporated as a source of energy. All right, now the second half of ecosystem study is looking at the non-living components of an environment. And that comes down to things such as nutrient cycling. Now, we're going to have to jump back a little bit, like back to lecture 3, where we talked about atoms and the more critical atoms for life. What were those 6 basic atoms that all life is made of? Remember my little word? Schnapps. Hey, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. These are the 6 fundamental elements that you'll find in every living organism on the planet. Now, they vary as far as the percentages and the degrees, but every living organism has these 6 basic elements. Well, we mainly look at carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus because these are fundamental for the stability of ecosystems. When we talk about nitrates and phosphates, such as in fertilizer and whatnot, that's really what we're talking about. We don't have to worry too much about carbon, as we'll show in just a little bit. But nitrogen and phosphates, these are essential for some of these key organic molecules. As such, we look at how they're recycled and maintained within an ecosystem. Now, this looks very confusing at first, but we're going to keep it nice and simple. There's 2 main ways in which organic molecules can be recycled. They can follow what we call sedimentary cycle, where they remain primarily as a chemical. They don't have what we call a gas state. But there's also the gas cycle of certain elements, like nitrogen and carbon and whatnot. So some elements follow one, some elements follow the other, and some actually do both. Okay, so we're going to look at what role some of these elements play. So let's look at phosphates, or phosphorus. Usually, we don't really talk about hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur because they come along for the ride for most of these, especially when you're dealing with phosphates with a lot of oxygen and things of that sort. So phosphates primarily follow solely a sedimentary cycle. There is no gas phase of phosphates. So their main way in which they're recycled is primarily through decomposition. Okay, so as organisms die, as feces are given off, and the decomposers break down that organic material, that goes right back into the soil where the producers will absorb that up. Now the same thing happens in aquatic ecosystems, except there's no soil in this case, but you still get the production of nitrates through decomposition that get recycled within these ecosystems as well. So phosphates. Phosphates are critical for the formation of things like ATP, your DNA, phospholipids that form the cell membrane, things of that sort. So phosphorus is one of those key elements. But there is no gas cycle. So ultimately it just follows through decomposition. Okay? So it follows a sedimentary cycle. Now, there is a problem today, especially when we take these phosphates, especially when we mine them out and then add them, such as a farmer might do. If you have excessive phosphates, this can actually disrupt the balance of the ecosystem. And so we'll see how that's the case too with nitrates, especially since we've been able to artificially manufacture nitrates from the atmosphere, and a lot of that runoff that's come about by the excess use of these phosphates has caused a lot of problems in certain ecosystems. In fact, in China a while back, a couple years back, they had so much runoff from a lot of the excess use of fertilizers that they had mass algae blooms that just disrupted huge coastal regions, so thick that people could actually lay on top of them and not sink in the water. So if you look that up, algae blooms in China, you'll see some news reports probably from a couple years ago, but it's pretty nasty. Remember, those are the protists. but they also thrive on phosphates. And as they have those nutrients, they're able to flourish very abundantly. All right, so phosphorus primarily follows a sedimentary cycle. Let's look at nitrogen. Okay, again, lots of different crazy things going on here, but we can simplify this down. Now, one of the things about nitrogen is when left to itself, nature pretty much regulates the amount of nitrogen. Maybe not as fast as we'd like it to, but it does have its way of regulating the nitrates in the soil. Nitrogen, again, is important for amino acids. Nitrogen is a key part of amino acids and such. And so plants need these nitrates in the soil. They can't get it from the atmosphere itself, even though the majority of air in which you breathe is nitrogen gas. About 60% or so of the air in which you breathe is nitrogen gas. But we can't incorporate the nitrogen into our biological material just by breathing it in. If you're a scuba diver or a deep sea diver, actually, you know this rule that you follow the bubbles up, because if you don't, you come up too fast, the nitrogen that you've been breathing in essentially gets in, comes out of your cells, forms bubbles in your blood, and can actually kill you. So the nitrogen doesn't get incorporated into your biology just by breathing it in. Even plants can't incorporate the nitrogen by bringing it in as a gas state. So even though there's this huge reservoir of nitrogen in the atmosphere, it can't be utilized by any organisms until it's been put into the soil. So that's why nitrogen follows both a gas and sedimentary cycle. The gas cycle is its reservoir. The nitrogen or sedimentary cycle in the soil, that's where it becomes most useful. Now, there's a couple of different forms. There's nitrates and there's ammonia. Both of these play key roles in various organic molecules. We're not going to make too much of a distinction between them, but I do want to point out two main groups of bacteria that play a key role in recycling. First, when there's not enough nitrogen in the soil, there are these bacteria that live in the nodules of plants called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These are the ones that take the gas form of nitrogen and turn it into the sedimentary form, things like ammonia, and there's other nitrifying bacteria that turn it into nitrates, but I'm mainly going to focus on the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Now, if there's too much nitrogen in the soil, again, as what typically happens when we add the artificial nitrogen fertilizers that we put in, then there is a way to get rid of a lot of that excess nitrogen. There are bacteria called denitrifying bacteria. These maintain balance by taking that excess nitrogen and turning it back into nitrogen gas. Okay? So the nitrogen-fixing bacteria take it from the gas to sedimentary form, and the denitrifying bacteria take it from a sedimentary form and put it back in the atmosphere. And this is how it maintains homeostasis on an ecological level. Okay? One thing that they've shown is that the nitrogen is able to remain more balanced when you just regulate nitrogen primarily through decomposition and the nitrogen bacteria being able to bring it in from the atmosphere. Because when we add excess amounts of that, it starts disrupting the balance of nitrates in the soil. Too much is not too good. Too little, obviously, the plants don't grow as well. But at the same time, they've shown experimentally over time, if you allow for decomposition to be the main recycler of nitrates, the soil does a lot better over time, and the plants do as well. But we live in a world where we need it now. So ultimately, we're still end up using nitrates or nitrogen fertilizers that are artificially made by converting nitrates into, we can fix it chemically into these nitrates and ammonia. Carbon follows primarily a gas cycle. Doesn't mean that there's not any carbon that is in the ground. However, when we look at the recycling of a chemical, we primarily look at how it gets back into the ecosystem through the producers. So with phosphorus, it's through the ground, sedimentary. With nitrogen, it ultimately has to be converted into a sedimentary form to be usable. But with carbon, it needs to be in the gas form. Why? What is the process that takes in carbon and turns it into a chemical? It's photosynthesis. So it has to come in via the gas stage. Yes, carbon is broken down in the soil. However, it's not usable as a carbon organic molecule for the plants. The plants don't absorb the carbon and then incorporate it in. They have to take it in through carbon dioxide. And so there is decomposition of this organic matter, and that does turn it back into carbon dioxide, but ultimately it follows primarily a gas cycle. Animals and such eat the food and undergo cellular respiration. We breathe out the carbon dioxide, and the plants pretty much take it back in. So this is one of the issues too, is that by the burning of fossil fuels and the excessive use of carbons as a fuel source, we're looking at higher amounts of carbon dioxide. And so ultimately, that regulation comes about by photosynthesis. Plants will take in the carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, making more food for us. So it's a key component in the stability of any ecosystem to have more photosynthesizers than other organisms. When we start reducing these through deforestation and other things, we start having some serious problems in the various ecosystems. Now, in aquatic ecosystems, the same thing holds true. Photosynthesis is the process even in algae, in these protists and photosynthetic bacteria and such that are in the ocean. When carbon dioxide dissolves in the water, it can be taken up as a gas. Okay. Now, we don't have any questions on the biosphere, but the study of the biosphere is essentially looking at the relationship of all ecosystems, all terrestrial and all aquatic ecosystems, which is a huge endeavor to understand. And this is where climate change and other models are trying to predict what's going to happen when one thing changes here and changes there, and it's a huge complex system. It's not very easy to work out. But we should be concerned about mass changes in that, because as I mentioned, if organisms have too much change in their environment and can't adapt, you start having collapse of various ecosystems, and there's a lot of fallout that can come about it to us as well from that. But mainly, you're going to be tested on these 3 nutrients and how they're recycled. Carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. These are the 3 types of questions you'll have on the nutrient cycling.